Well, this is the Doctrines of Grace, our first class. I've heard others frame it this way, which is to say, I'll pray, and if this isn't the class you want to be in, just leave during the prayer. We'll never know. But it is time. It's 5 minutes beyond the hour, so let's get started. We've got lots to talk about. Total depravity. We want to make sure we spend all the time we can on that, Paul. Right? Okay. Heavenly Father, we do thank you for your love and your grace, and we say that not just as a way of opening up prayers, but as we take time and pause and consider the richness of your love and your mercy and your grace toward us, Lord. We want to have a greater understanding of what that means and what it means to be a people who are formed by grace and by your love. And so, Lord, I pray that as we give our consideration to the doctrines of grace today and over the next 5 weeks, that we would grow in our love for you and in our worship of you as we respond to your goodness and your grace and your mercy in our lives. We pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Well, before we dive into the subject at hand, I thought I'd take just a couple minutes and discuss a little bit some bigger ideas about Reformed theology. It's actually been a number of years since we at Beverly Heights Church have taught a class on Reformed theology. I remember maybe in the first 3 years or so that I was here at Beverly Heights, Rick teaching a class on that, so that's maybe 14 years ago or so. We've obviously had classes and sermons and subjects that were discussed that intersected with Reformed theology, that intersected with the doctrines of grace, but it's been a number of years since we've taught on them formally and officially, and so it seemed like a good time to do that because of the timing here at Beverly Heights Church, but also the timing was good for me since I've been asked to teach on this at the seminary, Trinity School for Ministry, where I graduated from. I'm an adjunct in the Presbyterian program there, and I normally teach worship and polity, but they've asked me to teach on Reformed theology, and I told them I'd be happy to do that. And so this is an opportunity for me to kind of work through the material a little bit with you and get it ready for that class, but because I know you're a far more forgiving audience than seminary students. They're tough. So we're starting this class, and I wanted to kind of explore some of the big picture questions, which is, and to begin a little bit with some autobiography, and to reflect with you how it is that I became Reformed, because I was not actually raised Presbyterian. I was not raised in the Reformed tradition. The Reformed tradition and the Reformed faith was something that I was introduced to at Geneva College. It was alien to me, and it was difficult, actually, to be, my exposure to it was difficult. I remember spending a lot of time with Dr. Byron Curtis, who taught the Reformed theology at Geneva, and he was rather matter-of-fact about it. And I was hearing concepts for the first time and working out their implications and really struggling with what this all meant. And I remember actually one class staying after class and talking with Dr. Curtis and really pouring out my heart and pouring out my tears, saying, I don't understand how this can be true. I don't understand how we can accept the implications of what you're talking about. And I was somewhat offended by the doctrines of grace. To be perfectly honest, I found them offensive. And I really had a hard time. Not only were the doctrines rather hard, but my experience at Geneva and in the Bible program, in a school that was committed to Reformed theology and committed to an expression of Presbyterianism that is very, very conservative. Geneva College, if you don't know anything about it, they're strict Sabbatarians. We weren't allowed to do laundry on Sundays. They locked the doors to the laundromat. And you were not allowed to there was a number of things that you couldn't do as strict Sabbatarians. Their worship service and the life of the church was purely a cappella psalm singing. You didn't sing hymns. You didn't have guitars and drums. You didn't even have an organ. Everything was very, very strict and sober. And there was a certain identification with that tradition that was rather strong. And they would refer to themselves, students in the program and some who are associated with the Reformed tradition in that way, they would refer themselves as totally Reformed. They were known as TRs, capital T, capital R, TRs. And my roommates and I, who were not raised in the Reformed tradition, we called them behind their backs tragically Reformed. They were the tragically Reformed. And I really had a hard time kind of making inroads there, and there was a certain presumption. I think it was probably youthful confidence, but it just struck me as presumption and arrogance at the time, and I really struggled with it. I have since come to a place where I no longer call them tragically Reformed, although there are some who still are. I don't like the idea of being totally Reformed. I think that, again, that's a bit presumptuous. I have taken on the moniker and the idea of being charitably Reformed. I want to be charitably Reformed because I struggled with coming to grips with this doctrine and this tradition, and I needed some kind people to help me along. And some kind people did come along and did help me to understand and embrace this theological framework. So I want to return that kindness to others and to share all of this with you, not only today, but over the next 5 weeks in the most charitable way that I can. I want to be charitably Reformed. But there's no denying that I had a paradigm shift. Anybody know what that phrase means when you have a paradigm shift? What does that suggest, Jill?
Take your framework
and it moves, right? So the way you see the world is like this, and then something happens, some new insight, some new revelation, whatever, informs your vision of things, and the way that you see it, your picture window, your sight picture, moves slightly. Well, I think it might actually be rather disingenuous to say that I had a paradigm shift. I had a paradigm implosion. It blew up. The paradigm that I was working with, which was crazy charismatic. That was my upbringing. I grew up in the wild, wild west of the charismatic renewal of the 1970s. My parents were Roman Catholics who got saved in the Jesus movement of the 70s. They got into a charismatic church, and it was the circus. And there was a lot of great things that came with that. The best thing that came about that tradition that I continue to hold on to in my charitably Reformed is you can have all the doctrine and all the systems that you want or need, but if you don't have a personal relationship with Jesus, it doesn't count for anything. You have to know who Jesus is. He's a real person, and you can really know him, and you can really be in relationship with him. And that was what was communicated to me as a young kid, and I've held on to that all of my life. The Reformed tradition has changed my life, I think, for the better, but I've never lost sight of the fact that I need to know Jesus, and I need to love him, and he loves me, and I want to love him back. So anyhow, my paradigm blew up. It cratered. It was painful. It took me years to recover. And it was a long, slow process of rebuilding, but rebuilding in accord with the truth. Rebuilding in accord not just with the tradition, but with what the scriptures have to teach. And so I thought it would be an interesting thought experiment to ask the question for all of us, why am I Reformed? If you consider yourself to be a part of the Reformed tradition, why? Why do you hold to that identity? Why do you affirm that? Yes, Joan. Yeah. Because the Bible says so. Well, I have 3 reasons here, and that's essentially my first reason. The more and more I studied the scripture, it seemed to suggest that this system of doctrine actually made the most sense of what the Bible was saying. There are challenging texts on both sides of the divide. There's challenging texts that Reformed folks have to wrestle with because it seems to be in tension with the system of doctrine that they are purporting, that they are teaching. The same is true for, are we all familiar with what is essentially known as the counterbalance of the Reformed tradition would be called Arminianism? And we'll get into that in just a second. But Arminians, it seems to me as I read the text, actually had a far greater number of texts to have to account for and a lot farther to go to account for them. And so as I was reading the Scriptures, as I was studying the Scriptures formally in undergraduate and graduate school, the more I studied the Scriptures, the more the Reformed tradition seemed to me to make sense of what the Bible was teaching. There's no other way, I don't think, that you can understand Romans 9, 10, and 11. You just can't. You have to kind of just skip over those 3 chapters if you're going to read Romans, if you don't have at least some working understanding of what's going on within the Reformed tradition. So I became Reformed because I was convinced of the Scriptures. The Scriptures convinced me that this was a system of doctrine that makes the most sense of the text. And so I'm Reformed because I'm trying to be biblical. I'm biblically driven. And the Reformed tradition, I think, helps me and I think helps us to be the most biblical that we want to be and can be. Does that make sense? Second answer that I'll offer, unless anybody else wants to, go ahead.
Sovereignty of God.
Sovereignty of God.
I was going to say that too.
Yeah,
That's really strong. Sorry.
Sorry, I stole it from you.
No, I'll continue.
No, I just, as I saw God's sovereignty play out in my life, it affirmed Reformed tradition.
Yep.
I was going to say that too.
Okay, well, I was going to say it too because that's my second point.
And besides, that's our slogan on
The podcast, yep. I wrote here, this system of doctrine makes the most sense of my experience. It makes the most sense of the Bible, seems to me, and it makes the most sense of my experience. So, I am one of 3 kids. I have a twin brother, a younger sister, 2 parents who, as I shared, came to faith in the Jesus movement of the 70s. They were former Roman Catholics. I'm really the only child that is walking with a credible faith. Of the 3 kids, I'm the only one who I think would acknowledge, my siblings included, that I'm not only a pastor, but I have a faith to even hold on to. My parents divorced. It was an ugly mess. Their faith is kind of all over the place. And I ask myself the question, how in the world did I get to be where I am? There's nothing in my experience that can account for where I am and who I am today, except for the sovereignty of God. Now, that elicits one of 2 responses. As you consider your own experience, and you see where you're at, and if you believe that is part of the sovereignty of God, one of 2 things then comes after that. Either a question of justice or a question of grace. And I've asked both. God, why me and not them? Why me and not my twin brother? That's an important question. That's a good question to ask, but we have to recognize that that's a question of justice. And the doctrines of grace are not disinterested in justice, but it's in the title, it's in the name, Doctrines of Grace. The doctrines of grace in the Reformed tradition confronts me with matters of grace, with inequities. God has been gracious. He's been kind. He has called me to himself, and there's nothing that I can do other than to respond to that grace and saying, thank you. That doesn't mean that I give up on my brother. It doesn't mean that I give up on my family. I pray for them. I'm concerned about them. I want to see them walking in the fullness of the life of the kingdom, just as the Apostle Paul wanted that for the children of Israel in Romans chapter 9, 10, and 11. And he had great confidence and hope that God would ultimately graft them back in. But as he looked at his own experience, that he was called and he was converted and he was made into the man of God that he was made to be, he saw that it was a work of grace. And his response was in Romans. After thinking about all these things, he's saying, oh, the depth of the riches and the wisdom and the knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments, how inscrutable his ways. He is compelled to doxology, having considered the grace of God in his life. At the end of chapter 11, as he's dealing with the Reformed doctrines in chapters 9, 10, and 11, he's propelled to doxology and worship and to thank God for the grace. Oh, the depth and the riches and the wisdom and the knowledge of God, exclamation point. How unsearchable are his judgments, how inscrutable his ways, exclamation point. For who has known the mind of the Lord, and who has been his counselor, or who has given to him that he might be repaid? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen. This is a man who has asked the questions of justice, but he ends with a doxology of praise that has been informed by grace. And so the doctrines of grace require us to deal with grace. And the way in which grace comes to us is by God's gracious hand. And our responsibility is, in fact, responsibility. God gives us the ability to respond to the grace. That doesn't mean we can't ask questions of justice. Those are important questions to ask, but they're also above our pay grade. We have to trust whether or not God knows what he's doing. What he's doing with Israel, what he's doing with my family, what he's doing with our kids. And we respond to the grace and the goodness of God. Third reason I'm reformed. Did you have a question? Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Maybe we'll go 3 for 3.
I just find it interesting reading through church history. The people, the theologians I really admire, when you think of Augustine, Luther, Calvin, Newton, Edwards, they're all Reformed.
Yeah.
And that's not, infallible, but I find it very interesting in reading about these men, and certainly women too.
Yeah. Yep.
That they come from a Reformed tradition, the great theologians.
The great theologians. The one exception might be Wesley, but we're going to get to Wesley in just a little bit. So, that's true. He actually is. He's considered to be a great evangelist.
Right.
Really, nobody that I know of would consider him a theologian, and that's not a knock on Wesley. That's just he wasn't that. But he was prolific in his writing. But we'll get to Wesley here, I hope, in a little bit. The third reason why I'm Reformed is that as I've come to the Reformed tradition, what I've come to see is that this system of doctrine makes the most out of God, and it humbles me. And that's what Paul is doing in the end of Romans chapter 11. There's a certain arrogance that I shared with you that I found and could sniff on some of the Reformed folks in the circles that I ran in when I was younger. And I didn't like that, and I found that a little bit off-putting, and it was kind of repellent. But there's another humility that can come with the Reformed tradition, because the Reformed tradition requires us, it demands that we magnify God and we come to the Bible and we come to this doctrine humbly. It puts us, to put it inelegantly, it puts us in our place. I find that the Reformed tradition requires what you've heard Rick say, and I continue to say, a view from above, which is different than a view from below. The view from above versus the view from below. The view from above begins with God. We start with God. The view from below starts with me. The view from above says, what has God said? What has God decreed? What has God demanded? What has God done? The view from below starts with, well, who am I? What have I said? What have I done? What am I committed to? Those aren't unimportant questions. They're necessary questions, but the Reformed tradition, it seems to me, puts the priority correctly. It magnifies the Lord, and it humbles me. And if there's anybody who ever needed humbled, it was me. As you all know, I continue to come back to the doctrines of grace, and it is so much that it compels me to say, God, you are God and I am not, and I thank you for who you are and what you have done, and that you have shown such love to me. And that strikes me as the right posture to have as a Christian. And so I think the Reformed tradition helps me to do that well. and to do that best. So that's why I'm Reformed. Perhaps that helps to inform some of your thinking about the Reformed tradition. And I think that's a good way for us to start. Anything on that before we move on? I can already tell we're not going to get through all of my notes, so we may have to finish with the doctrines or with total depravity next week. But I want to do a little bit of setup with the Reformed tradition historically before we get into the first doctrine specifically. But any questions before I move us on? Okay. The doctrines of grace, I like that terminology, and I'll be perfectly forthright and honest with you. I am during this class, and in the class that I'm doing here and the one that I'm going to be doing at Trinity, I make no, there's no apology that I am following closely after James Montgomery Boyce. If you know that name, Dr. James Montgomery Boyce, he was the pastor at 10th Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia. He wrote 2 books before he died. One, just before he died, he finished it. The second one, he had an outline and he had several chapters written, and it ended up getting finished by Phil Ryken, which was his associate, so that they could finish the book and publish it. The second book was called The Doctrines of Grace. The first book was called Saved by Grace. And they're companion books that deal with this theology. And I think Boyce is just one of the best on this subject. Now, he makes references to a lot of others, Lorraine Botner and R.C. Sproul and John Murray. These are all great Reformed theologians. But Boyce was also a pastor, and that's what I am. I'm a pastor. And Reformed theology is important, but it has to work in a particular way, particularly in the church. I've heard this said one time with reference to both Greek, the Greek language, or pastors' engagement with the Greek, and pastors' engagement with Reformed theology. It's a little bit inelegant, but it's funny, I think, and it makes the point. People with wisdom will say, Reformed theology, or Greek, Peter, remember this since you're studying Greek, Reformed theology is a little bit like your underwear. Never go into the pulpit without it, but don't show it to anybody. I think that's true. I think that's true. You got to have it. You got to have it. But you don't have to flash it all the time. And this is a class that is examining it, so we're going to look at it. But I want to look at it as a pastor. And Boyce was a pastor, and so I'm following closely after Boyce on this. I think he's been tremendously helpful to me, and I think he'll be helpful to you. Boyce, he resisted referring to Reformed theology by use of the acronym TULIP. Now, most of us know of Reformed theology by one of 2 systems of theology, stuff that I would examine candidates and transferees into the denomination all the time. There are 2 fives. The first is TULIP, and the other are the 5 solas of the Protestant Reformation. So you needed to know 5 of something if you were going to pass and come into our presbytery. But Boyce was not so much interested in TULIP as much as he was wanting to talk about the doctrines of grace. And so that's what I've decided to refer to this in our class and moving forward. I want to talk not so much about TULIP, the acronym TULIP, but I want to talk about the doctrines of grace. But the doctrines of grace are shorthand for the 5 distinctive Bible teachings that were linked together in response to a theology that developed in Holland in the late 16th century. So the use of the word tulip and its connection with Holland has not just a theological significance, but there's a cultural and agricultural connection as well. They really stuck it to them, is what they did. We're going to use your best flour, and we're going to create a system of theology. So, the doctrines of grace were in response to a theology that was developed in Holland in the late 16th century. This theology was associated with the name Jacob Arminius, or as my Reformed theology professor at Geneva would say, because he was a very erudite man, his Latin name was Jacobus Arminius, or something like that. Jacobus Arminius. Jacob Jacob Arminius. Now, he lived in 1560 to 1609. And Arminius and his followers, they stressed the free will and self-determination of humanity. People are saved by their decision, essentially. We're going to get into that a little bit more in just a second. And this system of theology was in stark contrast to a theology that was developed earlier, just 50, 60 years earlier, by John Calvin. Does everybody know who John Calvin is? We don't have patron saints in Presbyterianism, but if we ever had one, I'm sure he would be elected as a strong candidate. John Calvin is actually unfortunate that he's known in ways that are more of a caricature than what he really thought and said and did. He was a guy who actually gave his life for the church in Geneva and Switzerland, right? And that's Geneva, Switzerland? Yeah. And they hated him. They brought him, they received him, they used him, they allowed him to minister, then they kicked him out because they didn't like him, they hated him, and then everything went to hell in a handbasket, and they said, come back. And he was kind enough to come back. Actually, there's a famous quote in which John Calvin said, I will never go back to Geneva. And as seniors, we actually printed those T-shirts when we graduated. Or donate to Geneva. So Calvin, but he was the reformer that was most prolific, along with Luther, who helped to develop Lutheranism. John Calvin and Luther and a few others were the Reformation luminaries that wrote to help to develop the Reformed tradition and Reformed theology. Well, Jacob Arminius was writing in response to that system of doctrine and saying, nope, Calvin got it wrong, and here's the way you're really supposed to think about it. Incidentally, there was one other person in church history who did this. Anybody know who it is? His name, hold on a second. It's not Charles Simeon, but I saw you, Scott, and that's the only one that went to mind. It's not Charles Simeon. It's, me and names, we don't always get along. It'll come back. Somebody Google the new measures. Peter, get on it. And he's also the father of revivalism, which is the father of Pentecostalism, Charles Finney. Charles Finney wrote a systematic theology that was point-for-point refutation of John Calvin. And Charles Finney, as I said, started revivalism. He was the guy who started the big tent revival type idea, the Sawdust Trail. He had very moving music in order to evoke people towards a decision. He was the guy who kind of pioneered what we sometimes refer to as the Baptist bus. And the Baptist bus is this way of framing the argument with folks to say, what would happen to you if you got hit by a bus today? You know, if you haven't given your life to Christ, what would happen if you were stepping off the curb and you got hit by a bus? Well, Charles Finney pioneered that approach in order to induce people towards a decision, because your decision and your freedom is what's paramount. And Calvin was on the other side of things. So Arminius is developing this theology. The Calvinists and the Reformers get together at what's called the Synod of Dort, and they respond to these theological deviations, and they develop at the Synod of Dort the acronym TULIP, or the 5 points of Calvinism. So what are the 5 points of Calvinism? Beginning with T. Total depravity. Okay. U. Unconditional election. All right. L. Limited atonement. I.
Irresistible grace.
And then finally, P.
Perseverance of the saints.
Perseverance of saints. That's the acronym, TULIP. Now, these were a direct refutation of the 5 points of Arminianism. Who among us can recite the 5 points of Arminianism? On the other side of total depravity is?
Sort of sinful.
Human ability. Sort of sinful. Weak but not broken. On the other side of unconditional election,
Free will.
conditional election. On the other side of limited atonement,
General.
Total.
indefinite. Indefinite. We don't know who Christ died for. On the other side of irresistible grace, resistible grace. And on the other side of perseverance of the saints, this one's a little bit clumsy, but it's called detectable grace. These are the 5 points of Arminianism. Human ability, conditional election, indefinite atonement, resistible grace, detectable grace. Boyce didn't like tulip. Yes?
Oh, just a question. These categories for Arminianism, whose terms are they? Are they Reformed terms for Arminianism, or are these Arminian, like we own tulip,
Right.
we accept tulip. Would an Arminian accept these terms, or is this Reformed terms for Arminianism?
That's a great question. I don't know. I'm not an Arminian, so I don't know what they would. I could actually read you the 5 summary statements. I didn't bring them, but there are summary statements that Arminian gave as to his positions, because he was the one who started the 5, and then Reformed tradition responded to his 5. So the fact that the Reformed tradition has 5 points is actually because they were responding to the 5 points of Arminianism. Now, I appreciate what Boyce is saying, because he's saying that tulip gets to a certain thing, but it's actually not a great acronym. He has some other things that he wants to talk about. So let me just remove these. Another way of putting it. And I understand his reasons for it. Rather than total depravity, he wants to talk about, Boyce is helpful as a pastor, he wants to talk about radical depravity. Okay? And we're going to talk about what that is and why, hopefully today, if we have time. See, I get 1 day per article when we go to Trinity, Peter. I get 45 minutes here, so we're doing it as fast as we can. Boyce wants to talk about radical depravity. He'll stay with unconditional election. And he wants to talk about particular atonement, not limited atonement. Boyce is also helpful talking about not irresistible grace, but efficacious grace. The effect that grace has. And then preserving grace. He gets as much grace in as he can. So rather than total depravity, radical depravity, unconditional election is the same. Rather than limited atonement, particular atonement. Rather than irresistible grace, efficacious grace. And rather than perseverance of the saints, the persevering grace of God on behalf of the saints. Okay. That is like super summary of Reformed tradition and history. There's a lot more that could be said. There's a lot that I left out, but this gets us into the 5 theological doctrines or pillars that we're going to be looking at for the next 4 weeks. Any questions about any of that? You got questions, but we'll save them. All right. Okay, let's start with total depravity. Why would Boyce have a problem with total depravity and want to talk about radical depravity? Well, there's a reason for this, and I deal with this all the time with candidates. I deal with this all the time when we're talking about this with folks who are coming to grips with the Reformed tradition for the first time. Total depravity is often assumed by those who are hearing it or learning it for the first time that it's making reference to utter depravity. Utter depravity. And utter depravity suggests that people are as bad as they possibly can be. Now, there's actually a theological and philosophical response to this that I think is helpful when you take things to their ultimate end. If folks, and I'll just get to the end and then we can work backwards. If folks were as bad as they possibly could be, utterly depraved, you would not exist. non-being is as close to, or is the full expression of depravity that one could have. So the fact that we are sinners who are still drawing breath is a function of God's grace and goodness in our life. Now, we are totally depraved or radically depraved when it comes to our relationship with God. We don't want anything to do with God. But if we were as bad or as corrupt or as broken as we possibly could be, you would not only not be able to draw breath, your whole being would disappear, everything would be gone. You would cease to exist, body, soul, spirit, everything. Utter depravity is to go into the realm of non-being. But by God's grace, He holds you, even sinners. He holds you in His hand and He holds you together, even though you don't want anything to do with Him. So to be totally depraved is to have every part of your heart, mind, and soul, when it comes to a relationship with God, has been affected, marred, corrupted. You don't want anything to do with God. To be totally depraved is to be an enemy of God, is to be a hater of God. It's not to lose all of your goodness. We had an interesting thought experiment with Dr. Bitar when I was talking about him in the first service. We were talking to him and we took his conversation, we took it to Curtis because we were playing one professor off the other. And the question that we asked was, is Satan intrinsically good? Think about that. Is Satan intrinsically good? Now, you have to unpack that question. What in the world are we saying? The devil seems like a really bad dude, and he is. But he is made by God, and he has a form. And that form and that being is called angelic. He cannot have that being, he cannot have that form unless God gives it to him. And he has it still. And so there's an intrinsic value or goodness that is retained in the person of the devil that he cannot get away from. And so there's an intrinsic goodness that still resides within the devil. There's an intrinsic goodness that resides even in Paul. Believe it or not. We all have it because we are all here drawing breath. God has given us life. He has given us a measure of His goodness that we might even walk the earth. And so there's something good about being made by God. How do we know this? Go back to the Bible. When God makes Adam and Eve, what does He say? Very good. And even sin can't overcome that. God has branded us all. He has marked us all with His goodness, and even sin cannot obliterate the goodness of God. As St. Augustine will say, thinking about sin in a philosophical, theological way, he would argue that evil is without substance in itself. You can't point to evil and say, there it is. All you can do is point to good things that are suffering. So you look at the baby who is dying in a third world country and you see evil, but you don't see evil in its own manifestation. Evil is a privation of the good. It's a weakening of the good. It's a marring of the good. And so there has to be good that exists in order for evil to be made known, in order for evil to be present. So humans, and even the devil, retain a certain measure of goodness. But that doesn't mean that we aren't totally depraved. We're not utterly depraved. We're totally depraved. Now that's a whole pretty important and juicy theological tidbit there. I don't want to rush past it too quickly. Does everybody understand what I'm saying about the difference between utter depravity and total depravity, evil and good? Let's explore that a little bit. Because this is an important, we're starting at the beginning, so let's set the trajectory right. Let's set the edge correctly. Any thoughts? Yes, Joe.
It seems to me that if we were utterly depraved, then God's grace would not be there. And you're talking about this as the doctrine of God's graces.
Doctrines of Grace, yeah.
So it seems that God's grace is great in us who are radically depraved.
Yeah.
So that's one aspect that I see.
It could have been that God said, on the day that you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will cease to be. Now, he didn't say that. He said, you'll die. You'll be dead. That has an effect on live people, on real people, but it doesn't obliterate them. It doesn't remove them off the face of the earth. It doesn't remove them from the mind of God. Their being continues, and that continuation of their being is a function of grace. That God allows sinful people to draw breath who are totally depraved is exclusively due to the grace of God. Because he could have, because he's sovereign, he could have made it such that he said, on the day that you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good, you will cease to be. No more being. But instead you have death, which is a type of being. Go ahead, Andrew.
How does total depravity kind of jive with some of the relationships in the Old Testament where it seems like God loved others more than, some, like for example, David, who was like depraved,
Yep.
very sinful.
Yep.
God loved him and said that he had my own heart. Or even Job, said he's blameless in the sight of the Lord.
Yeah. So the whole thing with Job is kind of interesting because the story of Job actually shows that Job, he couldn't suffer and die for the sins of his kids. The Bible is clear in saying that there was a blamelessness about Job, but it was not a complete blamelessness. Even Job, David, were all in the same boat. All of humanity, because of what Adam and Eve did, and because they represent the entirety of the human race, share in this depravity. And so when David has a heart after God, he has that heart because of grace. Now, that's not taking away certain responsibility that David has or that you have or that I have. But even that kind of a response to God is a result of God's grace in David's life. And we're going to get to that a little bit when we talk about what does it mean to be dead. Any positive response to God is a function of God's grace in our lives. And so God, his justice is over everybody. And his grace is over everybody. Because we draw breath. But there's a particular kind of grace that is shown towards those who come to confess their need for God and trust God in a particular way. And we're going to get to that in a little bit, and that's where some of the challenging aspects of all of this start to emerge. But before we can get there, we need to establish what is total depravity. Total depravity is everybody's heart is an enemy to God. It's dead, and we are enemies to God. And I have some texts that I want to share that confirm that. Did you have a question, Kate? Is that good with what you were saying? Okay. Kate, go ahead.
So in essence, because we're still held together by the word of, by the power of the Lord, even on an atomic level, there is still something good even in that, because we're still made in the image of God. Is it kind of?
Yes, there's a goodness there, but it's not a goodness that leads to salvation.
But also, if it had been complete, utter, ultimate
Utter
depravity,
depravity.
even if we had still kind of been here in some shape or form, there wouldn't have been anything left to. Not that there's anything in us that's rescuable, but because we still exist, there's something that can be redeemed.
Because we still exist, it's because God is gracious. It's not as though God is like, oh no, I got to do something. He's under no compulsion to have to do anything. Purely out of his grace and his goodness, he says, on the day that you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will die, which is actually better than going back to non-being. You're going to enter into a state of death, but it's different than non-being. Yes?
Correct me or help me figure this out. Everything that God made was good because he's sovereign and he had a plan from beginning to end. And he created the sons of God, which Lucifer was a son of God, right?
Yeah.
And they lived and saw the presence. Lucifer was the closest to him and most beautiful. When he decided to turn and fall, now he fell. God created sons of God. He made man in his image. Mm-hmm. But man didn't fall because he was face to face with God and decided to turn. He was deceived into it.
Right.
Okay, so the Redeemer came to redeem the sons of Adam and Eve, the sons and daughters, right?
Yep.
But there is no Redeemer for the fallen angels, so they're utterly depraved.
No, they're not utterly depraved, otherwise they would go into non-being.
I always wondered in Job why Lucifer was allowed to come into the court of, it's because it's scripture. He
Yeah.
comes in and God actually speaks with him.
Yep.
And that he's permitted, even though he was fallen and unredeemable after that. It's as if God's sovereignty has a plan from end to beginning, and he uses and knows that the tests and the evil make men's free will have to choose. You have to choose. But it's complicated.
Yeah, it's complicated, and I think we can affirm what the scriptures affirm, and that which the scriptures don't confirm, we can maybe speculate. But at the end of the day, again, the Reformed tradition is humbling, and it requires us to bow before the mystery and the power of God. You know, when it comes to Job, we actually don't know from the text if when Satan enters, if this is in his fallen state or pre-fallen state. It's not explicit about that. And I'm not prepared to make any kind of a speculation on that, but what I am saying is that it's not clear from the text that this is the rebellious Satan. It could be.
It was after man existed, so it was after the fall.
Yep, that's a good point. It's a really good point. Yeah. Yep, so why is God letting him into his presence? Grace is the answer to that question.
That he's not obliterated is
He's
the
not
grace of God.
obliterated. Yeah. Yeah, so you just made my argument. I
Well,
appreciate
sovereignty, you have to bow to sovereignty.
Yeah, so we're just kind of getting things heated up, and I don't want to stop, but we have to stop. Scott, did you have a quick question?
You differentiating between common grace and special grace?
Yes.
I thought that would have a lot to do with total depravity, how he allows us, all of us,
To enjoy common grace. You breathe the breath of life, but there's a special grace in which the totally depraved are redeemed. And it's grace, but the questions that arise in us when we hear that are questions of justice. And we're going to get to that. But first thing we have to establish is that everybody is sinful. Not as evil as we possibly can be, but that everybody has a heart that is depraved, that is resistant to God, an enemy of God. And we're going to look at the texts that support this in just a little bit, next week. And then we'll move on to the next doctrine, if we can, unconditional election, which is, they get increasingly challenging, actually. And yeah, just hang in there. And people have trouble with all of them. They're all troubling. But I think they make the most sense of the scriptures, as I'll continue to make an appeal to the scriptures over and over again. Alrighty, folks, thanks. We'll see you.